The coffee at the Greasy Spoon never really tasted like coffee, more like burnt nostalgia and weak hope, served in chipped mugs that rattled when you walked. I'd been wiping down booth 6 for the 3rd time that morning, my apron stained with syrup and something I didn't want to identify, when old Mr. Pettigrew from the hardware store tapped his spoon against his saucer and said, "Honey, you ought to see what that fella left behind." I turned, towel in hand, expecting another tip or a lost newspaper. Instead, he nodded toward the far corner, where a crumpled sheet of paper sat on a Formica tabletop like a stray leaf after a storm. My resume. The one I'd printed on the library's last working printer yesterday, the paper slightly warped from humidity, my name bold at the top, Clarissa Thorne. I'd tucked it into my bag before my morning shift, just in case a recruiter ever walked into a place like this, which, of course, they never did. But someone had found it, read it, and left without finishing their coffee. "He was all dressed up," Mr. Pettigrew said, lowering his voice like we were sharing state secrets. "Dark suit, silver hair slicked back, eyes red like he'd been crying. Sat there 10 minutes, read every line twice, then just stood up and walked out. Left a $100 bill under the saucer." My stomach dropped, not because of the money, though that would have covered my electric bill, but because of the description. Silver hair, red eyes, a man who looked like he'd just lost something or found it. I didn't say a word, just folded the resume carefully, smoothing the creases with my thumb like it was sacred. I'd spent hours on that document, listing my volunteer work at the animal shelter, my incomplete degree in business administration, my interim barista and prep cook, title with a quiet dignity I didn't always feel. At the bottom, in small font, references available upon request. No mention of Thorne Industries. No mention of my grandfather, Silas Thorne, billionaire, logistics pioneer, ghost of my childhood. I'd erased him on purpose. Because the last time I saw him, I was 6 years old, standing on the marble steps of a mansion I wasn't allowed to enter, watching my mother slam the car door and whisper, "We don't need his money. We don't need him." And for 20 years, I hadn't. Until today. 10 hours later, my phone buzzed with a text from a blocked number. "Open the door." I lived in a 3rd-floor walk-up above a laundromat that groaned like a tired animal all night. My hallway smelled of mildew and takeout. I peered through the peephole, heart hammering like I'd done something wrong. And there he was. Silas Thorne, older, thinner, his tailored coat slightly wrinkled from travel. In one hand, a worn leather satchel. In the other, my resume, now neatly folded, tucked inside a plastic sleeve like a museum artifact. He didn't smile, didn't reach for me, just looked at me with eyes that mirrored my own gray, guarded, haunted by the same questions. "Why didn't you tell me you were drowning?" he asked, voice rough like he hadn't used it in days. The streetlight from below cast long shadows across his face, but I saw it, the glint of that familiar silver locket I wore under my shirt, the one my mother gave me the day she died. He was wearing its twin. On the surface, I was just another tired girl in a diner apron, surviving paycheck to paycheck. But in that moment, standing barefoot on cold linoleum, I wasn't invisible anymore. I was seen, fully, fiercely, finally. And the man who'd vanished from my life had flown across 2 time zones just to say, "I saw you, and I'm not letting go again." That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of the adrenaline, not because a billionaire grandfather had shown up at my door like a plot twist in someone else's life, but because I kept staring at the resume on my kitchen table, now resting under a clean coffee mug like it deserved to be preserved. It looked so ordinary. White paper, black ink, a font called Calibri that I'd chosen because it felt neutral. But to him, it had been a lifeline. A signal flare from a ship I thought had sunk long ago. Around 2 a.m., I opened my laptop. The screen cracked near the hinge, held together with duct tape, and scrolled through old photos. Me at 12, holding a science fair trophy my mom couldn't afford to frame. Me at 19, walking across a community college stage with no one in the bleachers. Me last winter, shoveling snow in a thrift store coat, breath fogging the air like a ghost trying to prove it still existed. Then I opened a new tab, typed a few lines, and posted a cropped image of the resume on a private storytelling forum I sometimes lurked in. I blurred my name, changed the contact info, but left one line visible in the education section. Ivy League dropout, circumstances beyond control. Beneath it, I wrote, when your CV ends up in the wrong hands or maybe the right ones. I hit post and closed the laptop, expecting silence. Maybe a few pity comments if I was lucky. By sunrise, my inbox was on fire. Over 300 replies, some from nurses who'd been cut off after choosing caregiving over corporate ladders, others from sons disinherited for coming out, daughters erased after questioning family trusts, cousins ghosted when they asked for tuition help. One woman wrote, my resume once got left on a church pew. My uncle found it, read it aloud at Easter dinner, and said, this girl thinks she's somebody. I moved to another state the next week. Another said, I kept applying under my married name so my father wouldn't find me. He tracked me through a LinkedIn typo. Their words wrapped around my chest like a weighted blanket, comforting, but heavy with shared grief. I wasn't alone in being made to feel small for wanting more. I wasn't crazy for thinking that a piece of paper listing my skills shouldn't have to double as a plea for basic dignity. And that's when I realized something. My post wasn't just a vent, it was an invitation. So I added a comment of my own, right at the top. If you've ever been told your ambition was too much or your needs were inconvenient, drop a fork and knife below. Yes, a fork, from the diner. It's my symbol now. Within hours, the emoji flooded in. Forks everywhere. Silver ones, cartoon ones, even someone photoshopping a golden fork onto a throne. It was silly. It was sacred. It was solidarity. I didn't ask for advice. I didn't need a rescue plan, not yet. What I needed was proof that my story wasn't shameful. That being overlooked didn't mean I was unlovable. That a resume left on a diner table could be both a vulnerability and a declaration. I am here. I am trying. And I deserve to be seen, not for what I can give, but for who I am. And in that thread of strangers turned allies, I found something I hadn't realized I'd lost. The quiet certainty that my existence mattered, even before the jet landed. Even before the silver-haired man knocked on my door. But still, I kept glancing at my phone, waiting, because validation from the internet was warm, but the real reckoning was going to come from the man who'd read my resume and saw not a stranger, but his granddaughter. And I had no idea what came next. The house I grew up in didn't have a grand staircase or a chandelier. It had peeling beige paint, a refrigerator that hummed like a nervous tick, and a front porch where my mother sat every Sunday night, cigarette in hand, staring at the sky like it owed her answers. But before all that, before the fall, before the silence, there was another house. A real one. Red brick, ivy crawling up the columns, a black iron gate with the letter T curled into its scrollwork like a secret. Thorn Manor. At least that's what the neighbors called it. To me, it was just Grandpa's. I only visited twice. The first time I was 4. I remember the marble floors so cold they made my bare feet ache, the scent of lemon oil and old books, and the way Grandpa's study had floor-to-ceiling windows that turned the whole room gold in the late afternoon. He let me sit in his leather chair, too big for me, and slide open the drawers of his desk, where I found a silver locket with my initials engraved on the inside. CMT Clarissa Me Thorne. For when you're ready, he'd said, fastening it around my neck with fingers that smelled like pipe tobacco and ink. I wore it to bed that night. Wore it every night after, even when Mom stopped talking about him. The second visit was the last. I was 6. Something had happened, words shouted behind closed doors, a slammed ledger, my mother's voice cracking like dry twigs. You don't get to decide what's best for her. I didn't understand it then. Only that we left in the rain, my small hand clutched in hers, my locket tucked under my sweater like contraband. On the drive home, she told me, we don't need his money, we don't need his rules, we have each other. And for a while, that was enough. But then she got sick, and the enough became not nearly enough. Thorne Industries wasn't just a company, it was a global machine. Ships, warehouses, logistics hubs in 17 countries. My grandfather had built it from a single truck and a handshake after the war. Outsiders called him ruthless, visionary, a titan. But I'd seen him kneel to tie my shoe. I'd heard him hum old jazz tunes while watering his roses. To the world, he was Sela's Thorne, billionaire. To me, he was the man who saved the burnt cookies I made and called them crispy masterpieces. Yet after Mom cut ties, his name became forbidden. When I asked about him in school projects, she'd say, "Put deceased, it's simpler." When mail came with the thorn letterhead, she'd toss it unopened into the recycling bin without a word. I learned to erase myself before anyone else could. On job applications, I used my middle name. On college forms, I listed only my mother's maiden name. I even changed the locket's chain to a dull black cord so it wouldn't catch the light and betray me. But the truth clung like static. Because every time I walked past a delivery truck with the Thorn logo, a sleek black T inside a compass rose, I felt it. Not envy, not anger, a quiet, aching dissonance, like watching your reflection in a window you're not allowed to enter. The house on Sycamore Lane, the one with the crooked shutter and the neighbor who watered our plants when Mom was in the hospital, wasn't just shelter. It was a shrine to survival. And every time I polished that silver locket with the edge of my shirt, I wasn't just remembering my grandfather. I was asking, silently, "Did you forget me? Or did you just think I'd forgotten you?" I never imagined he'd been asking himself the same question, while holding a crumpled resume in a diner booth 200 miles away. After Mom died, time didn't stop. It just hollowed out. The days stretched like taffy, sticky and thin, and I moved through them like a shadow wearing my skin. Her funeral was a Tuesday in March, gray sky, wet ground, and barely a dozen people under the awning. I wore her favorite cardigan, slightly too big, faintly smelling of lavender and the almond soap she used, and clutched a single white rose I'd bought with the last of my grocery money. Someone handed me a bouquet of orchids afterward, wrapped in silk ribbon, with no card. I assumed it was from one of her old coworkers. I didn't know then that Silas Thorne had sent his private driver 300 miles to deliver them, only to be turned away at the cemetery gates by a cousin who whispered, "She wouldn't have wanted him here." I inherited her debt, not the kind you file in probate, $47,000 in medical bills the insurance never covered, a maxed-out credit line she'd taken out for just in case, and a lease that suddenly belonged to me alone. I dropped out of my business program 2 semesters shy of graduation because I couldn't afford the books, let alone the rent. The university offered a leave of absence, but leave implies you're coming back. I wasn't sure I'd ever find my way back to that path. So I became invisible by necessity. Barista at the Greasy Spoon in the mornings. Stock clerk at the all-night pharmacy 3 nights a week. Weekends, I cleaned offices for a property management firm that paid in cash and never asked for ID. My apartment had one window that didn't quite close, so in winter, I slept with a towel stuffed in the gap and 3 thrift store blankets stacked like armor. My laptop, ancient, wheezing, was my lifeline. I updated my resume every Sunday night, not because I expected miracles, but because it was the only way I could prove to myself I hadn't given up. Meanwhile, out in the world, Thorne Industries expanded into renewable logistics. Forbes listed Silas in their top 10 visionaries over 80. Paparazzi snapped photos of him at charity galas, always alone, always wearing a dark suit and that same unreadable expression. I'd see his face on newsstands while grabbing a $1 coffee and feel nothing, or everything. It was hard to tell the difference anymore. The imbalance wasn't just in bank accounts, it was in legacy. He held boardrooms, private jets, a name that opened doors. I held bus transfers, overdue notices, and a resume I printed on recycled paper because new felt like a luxury I hadn't earned. He was mentioned in history books. I was barely mentioned in my own life. And yet, on some level, I think I still hoped. Not for money, never that, but for acknowledgement. For someone to look at me and say, "You're a Thorne, you belong." Instead, I'd been taught that love came with conditions and family came with contracts. So I stopped reaching, stopped writing, stopped believing that blood meant anything if it wasn't backed by proof. But then, 10 hours after a stranger read my resume in a diner booth, I opened my door to find that same man standing in my hallway, eyes red-rimmed, holding the very document I'd written in shame, like it was a sacred text. And in that moment, I realized the cruel truth. I hadn't been forgotten. I'd been waiting in the wrong place for someone who'd been looking for me all along. He came back the following Tuesday, not in a limousine, not with bodyguards or assistants clearing a path, but in a simple black town car that idled quietly at the curb, its windows tinted just enough to hide the world but not keep it out. This time, he wasn't alone. Beside him sat a woman so small she seemed carved from memory itself, silver hair coiled in a neat bun, pearl earrings catching the late afternoon light, hands folded over a leather-bound notebook that looked older than I was. She wore a tailored wool coat the color of storm clouds, and when she stepped onto the sidewalk, she moved with the quiet precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime ensuring that chaos never touched the man she served. "Clarissa," Grandpa said, his voice softer now, less like a CEO and more like the man I remembered from the rose garden. "This is Eleanor Delaney. She's been with me since before your mother was born." Mrs. Delaney didn't offer a handshake. Instead, she looked at me, really looked, and her eyes filled so fast I thought she might cry right there on my cracked welcome mat. "Oh, child," she whispered, "you have her smile, and his eyes." Then, without another word, she stepped past me into my apartment like she'd been invited 100 times before. I stood frozen in the doorway, heart pounding. This wasn't how billionaire reunions were supposed to go. No lawyers, no press, just tea and truth. She moved to my kitchenette, the one with the flickering overhead bulb and mismatched mugs, and set her notebook on the counter like it was a relic. "I brought chamomile," she said, pulling a tin from her purse. "Your grandfather always said it was your mother's favorite." She filled my kettle with water from the tap, her movements practiced, maternal, as if she'd done this in 100 homes for 100 heartbroken girls. Grandpa stayed near the door, hands in his pockets, watching me like I might vanish if he blinked. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted quietly. "Not after reading that resume. You listed self-taught Excel and conflict de-escalation like they were nothing. Those aren't skills, Clarissa. That's survival." Mrs. Delaney poured the tea into my chipped, world's okayest barista mug and handed it to me. Steam curled between us like a question. Then, without fanfare, she opened the notebook to a page near the back, yellowed at the edges, and slid it across the counter. It was a handwritten log, dated, detailed. March 12, 2008, $25,000 deposited into Clarissa Me Thorne Educational Trust, account XXXX. Mailing address updated per postal confirmation. June 3, 2010, deposit returned. Reason, no forwarding address on file. Resent with certified mail. August 17, 2012, returned again. Attempted contact via maternal line, blocked number. January 5, 2015, deposit made. Returned. Letter included. Please tell her I'm still here. And on, and on. Through every year of my adolescence, every college application season, every time I'd sat in a financial aid office trying to explain why I had no family support. "He never stopped," Mrs. Delaney said, her voice trembling just slightly. "Every January 1st, without fail, he'd sit at his desk at dawn and say, 'It's for Clarissa.' He'd sign the transfer himself, watch the confirmation email like it was a birthday card, and when it bounced back, she shook her head. He'd just say, 'Try the post office again,' for 14 years. I stared at the page, my tea forgotten, my throat tight. All this time, I'd believed he'd chosen to forget me. But the truth was worse and more beautiful. He'd been trying to reach me while I was buried in a system that didn't care about returned mail or broken addresses. Then she reached into her coat and pulled out a photograph. Faded, creased at the corners. Me at 8 years old, standing in Grandpa's rose garden, holding a watering can too big for my arms, grinning like I own the sun. On the back, in his handwriting, "She'll find her way back. I'll be waiting." Mrs. Delaney placed a gentle hand on my arm. "He never stopped waiting," she said. "And now that he's found you, he won't let go again." Grandpa didn't speak. He just stood there, eyes glistening, as if seeing me for the first time, not as a liability, not as a ghost, but as the granddaughter he'd lost and now, impossibly, held in his line of sight. And in that tiny kitchen, with steam rising and a ledger of love laid bare on the counter, I finally understood. I hadn't been abandoned. I'd been loved in the dark, patiently, persistently, faithfully, by a man who kept sending light, even when it never reached me. The next morning, I sat at the county public library, same scarred oak table where I'd drafted my resume weeks before. Only now, instead of job boards and cover letter templates, my screen displayed the login portal for the state trust registry. My fingers trembled as I typed in the trust name. Clarissa Me Thorne Educational Fund, established 2008. I'd never known it existed. Not officially. Not until Mrs. Delaney slid that notebook across my kitchen counter like a map leading back to myself. The system loaded slowly, the dial-up whir of the library's ancient printer echoing in the quiet room. Then, there it was. A digital ledger stamped with the county seal, listing every transaction from the trust's inception. Deposit after deposit, year after year. $25,000 each January, always from Thorne Family Holdings, LLC. Always marked intended beneficiary, Clarissa M. Thorne. And beside each entry, in red ink automatically generated by the system, RETURNED, address UNDLIVRABLE. I scrolled down, breath shallow, 14 entries, $350,000 in total, plus accrued interest, another $37,000 the bank had held in limbo, waiting for a claimant who never came. But it was the notes section that shattered me. 2011, beneficiary reported deceased by maternal contact, disputed. No death certificate filed. 2014, attempted in-person verification at last known address. Tenant denied knowledge of occupant. 2017, legal counsel advised dormancy protocol. Trust placed in suspended status pending heir confirmation. I'd been declared dead. Not by malice, but by silence. By a forwarding address that expired when we moved after Mom's third hospitalization. By a phone number disconnected when the bill went unpaid. By a world that assumes if you fall off the grid, you've chosen to disappear. I printed the entire registry history, 8 pages, single-spaced, watermarked with the county clerk's insignia. The paper felt heavy in my hands, like holding years of missed birthdays, unanswered letters, and quiet despair. On the last page, there was a footnote. Trust may be reactivated upon verified identity claim at registered financial institution with supporting documentation. That afternoon, I met Grandpa and Mrs. Delaney at First Metropolitan Trust, the same bank where, decades ago, he'd opened his first business account with $300 and a handshake. The lobby was all marble and mahogany now, but the vault door still bore the same brass plaque, Est 1947. A private banking officer met us in a sunlit consultation room. No pleasantries, just documents. I handed over my birth certificate with both parents' names, my mother's death certificate, and the county trust registry printout. Grandpa added a notarized affidavit of lineage, and then, from his inner coat pocket, he produced a slim manila envelope. Inside was a letter dated January 3, 2010, written on Thorne Industries letterhead, signed in his unmistakable script. To whom it may concern, and especially to Clarissa when she is ready. This trust is not a gift, it is a promise. I promised your mother I would never interfere. I promised myself I would never stop trying. So I set this aside, not to control your life, but to honor your choices. Use it for school, use it to travel, use it to start over. Or don't use it at all. But know this, you were never unworthy, you were always mine. Grandpa. The banker read it silently, then cleared his throat. We can process reactivation today, he said, voice uncharacteristically soft. The funds have never been dispersed. They've been held in a segregated interest-bearing account per state law. He clicked a few keys, printed a new statement, and slid it across the table. There it was, $387,412.03. All mine, not as a handout, not as a payoff, but as a correction, a restoration. I didn't cry, not then. But as I folded the bank statement into my bag, next to the trust registry and Grandpa's letter, I felt something shift inside me. Not relief, not joy, but something deeper. The quiet click of a lock finally turning after years of rust. The receipts weren't just proof of money. They were proof I'd been remembered. And that, more than anything, was the inheritance I'd always needed. For a while, everything felt like it was finally tilting toward balance. I'd walk past the greasy spoon and wave at Mr. Pettigrew through the window, no longer in an apron, but in a coat I'd bought secondhand with my own money from a part-time tutoring gig I'd picked up. I'd enrolled in night classes again, this time with a payment plan that didn't make my stomach drop. And Grandpa, he called every Sunday at 7 p.m. sharp, not to offer solutions, but to ask questions. "How was your professor? Did you finish that book I sent? What do you need that I haven't thought of?" He was careful, almost reverent, as if I were a fragile bird that might fly away if startled. But pride is a quiet thief. It lets you think you're standing tall when really, you're just standing alone. So when he offered to clear my $12,000 in medical debt, the last of Mom's bills that had somehow followed me like a ghost, I said no. "I'll pay it," I told him over coffee at my kitchen table, the same one where Mrs. Delaney had served chamomile. "I don't want to feel like I owe you." He didn't argue, just nodded, eyes sad but respectful. "Then let me help you build a bridge," he said, "not a lifeboat." But the bridge wasn't ready when the storm hit. 2 weeks later, my landlord slid a bright yellow notice under my door. Eviction proceedings initiated, 72 hours to vacate or pay in full. I'd missed one rent payment while waiting for my tutoring check to clear, a delay of 5 days, but in the world of bottom-line landlords, that was a lifetime. I called, pleaded, offered to clean the entire building in exchange for time. He hung up. Then the next blow, my laptop, the same duct-taped warrior that had survived 3 jobs and 2 moves, died during a Zoom interview with a nonprofit I'd been trying to break into for months. The screen went black mid-sentence as I was explaining my passion for community-based education. The interviewer's face froze in polite confusion before the call dropped. I tried rebooting it a dozen times. Nothing. The hard drive was gone. And with it, my resume drafts, my class notes, my entire digital life. I sat on the floor of my apartment, back against the peeling wall, staring at the dead machine like it had betrayed me. Outside, rain began to fall, a cold, indifferent drizzle that matched the numbness spreading through my chest. I had no money for a new laptop. No family couch to crash on. No safety net except the one I'd refused to step onto. That night I called Grandpa, not to accept help, but to tell him I was okay. "Just a rough patch," I said, voice steady despite the lump in my throat. "I've handled worse." There was a long pause. Then, quietly, "Clarissa, handling worse doesn't mean you have to keep handling it alone." I wanted so badly to believe that, but somewhere deep down, I'd internalized the old lesson. If you take their help, you lose your right to your anger. If you let them fix it, you admit you couldn't do it yourself. And after a lifetime of doing it myself, the idea of surrender, even to kindness, felt like failure. So I didn't call back when he texted the next morning. "I've reserved a workstation for you at the Foundation's Community Learning Center. They have everything you need. No strings." I didn't go. Instead, I borrowed a library computer, rewrote my resume from memory, and walked into the interview 2 days later in a borrowed blazer and shoes that pinched my toes. I answered every question with fire, with grace, with the kind of grit that only comes from surviving when no one's watching. And I got the job. But as I stood outside the building afterward, rain soaking through my thin jacket, I didn't feel triumph. I felt exhaustion and loneliness. Because in that moment, I finally understood. Pride without support isn't strength, it's isolation. And isolation was the very thing that had kept me invisible for 20 years. I had survived. But surviving isn't the same as living. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop choosing one over the other. The morning after the interview, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the eviction notice still taped to my door like a scar I couldn't peel off. I'd gotten the job, yes, but the first paycheck was 3 weeks away, and the landlord wasn't budging. I'd maxed out my last credit card buying a used laptop from a pawn shop, its keys sticky and the battery lasting 30 minutes. I was back in survival mode, and the irony wasn't lost on me. I'd just been hired to empower underserved communities while I couldn't even keep a roof over my own head. That's when I called Grandpa, not to refuse, not to negotiate, but to say the words I'd been avoiding for months. I need help. He didn't say, I told you so. Didn't gloat, just said, be ready in 20 minutes, Aliner's picking you up. Mrs. Delaney arrived in a modest sedan, not the town car this time. No logos, no pretense. She handed me a paper sack with a still-warm croissant and a thermos of tea. You look like you haven't slept, she said gently. Today isn't about fixing everything. It's about correcting what was misfiled. Our first stop was the county clerk's office, a squat brick building with flickering fluorescents and a line of weary citizens waiting to be seen. Grandpa was already there, standing at the counter with a stack of forms. He'd spent the morning gathering every change of address confirmation I submitted after Mom died, every utility bill with my name on it, every piece of paper that proved I'd tried to stay anchored while the world kept shifting beneath me. A clerk with tired eyes reviewed the documents, then nodded. We can file a retroactive address validation with court certification, she said. It won't erase the past, but it'll stop future misrouting, and it'll serve as supporting evidence for trust reactivation. Next, we went to First Metropolitan Trust, the same bank where we'd first uncovered the dormant account. This time, the private banking suite felt different, not intimidating, but purposeful. Grandpa sat beside me as the bank officer pulled up the trust file on his screen. With the county's new address validation stamped and notarized, the bank could legally unfreeze the funds and authorize disbursement. But Grandpa didn't ask for a wire or a checkbook. Instead, he leaned forward and said, We'd like to establish a structured withdrawal plan, $1, $500 monthly for living expenses, direct tuition payments to her school, and the remainder held in the trust until she's ready to access it independently. Then came the moment I'll never forget. From his briefcase, he withdrew a single sheet of paper sealed in a clear protective sleeve. It was the letter he'd written in 2010, the one that said, You were never unworthy. You were always mine. The bank officer placed it on the scanner, verified the signature against archived corporate records, cross-referenced the date with internal memo logs. And then, with a soft click of the mouse, stamped it in the system. Document AUTHNTICATD, supporting evidence for beneficiary claim. Mrs. Delaney reached over and squeezed my hand. Her eyes glistened. He wrote that the night your mother called and told him never to contact you again, she whispered. He wrote it anyway, just in case you ever found your way back. The officer printed a full updated statement, $387,412.03, now active, with my name boldly printed as sole beneficiary. He handed me a new trust card, matte black, embossed with my initials, along with a secure login for the online portal. You have full access, he said, but the structure your grandfather proposed, it's there to protect you from the pressure of it all. You decide when to change it. As we stepped out into the afternoon sun, Grandpa didn't offer to buy me a new apartment or a fancy car. He just looked at me and said, Now you're not just surviving, you're grounded. And for the first time, I believed him. Because the receipts weren't just proof of money anymore. They were proof of intention. Proof that someone had fought for me in the quiet, through returned mail, bureaucratic dead ends, and years of silence, just by never stopping to try. And now, with a bank statement in my bag and a letter verified by law, I wasn't just Clarissa the barista. I was Clarissa Thorne, seen, claimed, and finally, irrevocably home. He didn't throw a gala, didn't summon the press or stage a tearful reunion on a balcony for the world to gawk at. No, Silas Thorne chose something far more dangerous, intimacy. He invited us, all of us, to dinner. Not at some grand estate or Michelin-starred restaurant, but in the private dining room of his penthouse apartment overlooking the city skyline. Just 6 seats around a table of warm walnut, soft candlelight flickering in blown glass holders, the scent of rosemary and seared duck hanging in the air like a quiet promise. The guests were carefully selected. Mrs. Delaney, of course, 2 longtime board members who'd served with him since the 80s, his personal attorney, a woman named Dr. Lynn with sharp eyes and a calm voice, and me. I wore my best blazer, the one I'd bought after my first real paycheck from the nonprofit, paired with dark slacks and the silver locket tucked just beneath the collar. And underneath it all, folded neatly in my inner pocket like armor, was my diner apron. Not for show, but as a reminder, don't forget where you came from, even when they finally see you. Grandpa met me at the elevator. He didn't hug me, not yet, but his eyes lingered on the locket, and for a second his composure cracked. "You kept it," he said, voice rough. "I never took it off," I replied. Dinner began with roasted beets and goat cheese, conversation light but deliberate. The board members, Mr. Hayes and Ms. Chen, asked about my work at the community center, my classes, my thoughts on sustainable urban outreach. They didn't treat me like a charity case or a curiosity. They treated me like a colleague, like someone who belonged. But I could feel the unspoken question hanging in the air. Why now? Why her? When dessert arrived, dark chocolate torte with sea salt caramel, I set my spoon down and cleared my throat. The room fell silent. Even the soft jazz from the speakers seemed to hush. "I know some of you may be wondering," I said, voice steady despite the pulse in my wrists, "how someone like me, barista, dropout, eviction notice fresh in her pocket, ends up at this table." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper. My resume, the original, crumpled, coffee-stained, but now laminated in clear plastic like a museum artifact. "This is how." I passed it around the table. One by one, they read it, not with pity, but with growing respect. Mr. Hayes traced the line about conflict de-escalation with his thumb. Ms. Chen smiled at the volunteer hours listed under community leadership. Then Grandpa stood. He didn't raise his voice, didn't gesture dramatically. He simply placed his napkin on the table and said, "Many of you believed Clarissa was lost to us, that the rift with my daughter was too deep, too final." He looked at me. But she wasn't lost. She was working. While the rest of us debated legacies in boardrooms, she was mopping floors at 5 a.m. so she could study at night. She was choosing dignity over desperation, again and again. He picked up my resume and held it like a sacred text. "This isn't just a list of skills. It's a record of resilience. And it's the reason I'm not just reinstating her as my heir. I'm appointing her to the Thorn Foundation Board, effective next quarter." A beat of silence. Then Ms. Chen nodded slowly. "She's got more real-world empathy in one paragraph than our entire outreach committee." Mr. Hayes added, "And she understands resource constraints better than any consultant we've hired." In that room, under the glow of candlelight and the weight of witnessed truth, the narrative shifted. I wasn't the poor relation stumbling into wealth. I was the heir who'd earned her place long before she knew she had one. And when Grandpa finally reached across the table and covered my hand with his, wrinkled, strong, trembling just slightly, I didn't pull away. Because for the first time, I wasn't being handed a seat at the table. I was being recognized as someone who'd built her own chair and carried it all the way here. The next evening, the same dining room was set again, but this time the mood was different. No wine, no duck, no soft jazz. Just a long table, 6 chairs, and a single manila folder resting at the head, where Grandpa would sit. The board members arrived in somber suits, not the polished elegance of the night before, but the quiet gravity of people preparing to witness something official. Mrs. Delaney sat beside me, her hand resting lightly on her ever-present notebook. Dr. Lin, the attorney, placed a digital recorder in the center of the table and gave a small nod. Grandpa entered last. He wore a charcoal suit, no tie, and the silver locket I'd given him peaked just above his collar, his silent answer to mine. He didn't sit right away. Instead, he walked to the window, looked out over the city lights for a long moment, then turned and said, "Tonight isn't about celebration. It's about correction." He opened the folder. Inside were 3 documents, each printed on crisp, legal-weight paper, each bearing the embossed seal of the Thorn Family Trust. "Before we proceed," he said, "I want everyone to understand this isn't personal, it's procedural, and it's necessary." Then he began to read, not with anger, but with the calm precision of a man who'd rehearsed these words in his head for years. The Thorn Family Trust, established July 12, 1995, originally designated Clarissa Me Thorn as primary successor beneficiary upon the death of her mother, Eleanor Marie Thorn, with full rights to residence, education funding, and eventual board appointment, contingent only on age and willingness. His voice didn't waver. However, due to a prolonged familial estrangement and administrative error, compounded by deliberate misinformation from an external party, the trust was mismanaged, beneficiary access denied, and rightful claims obstructed for over 14 years. He paused, looked at me. All of that ends tonight. He then read aloud a formal resolution, drafted by Dr. Lin and notarized that morning. Effective immediately, Clarissa Me Thorne is hereby reinstated as sole primary beneficiary of the Clarissa M. Thorne Educational and Legacy Trust, with full access to principal and accrued interest. Furthermore, she is granted a voting seat on the Thorne Foundation Board, with responsibilities beginning next fiscal quarter. All previous attempts to disqualify, obscure, or delay her inheritance are hereby voided under Section 12.4 of the Trust Codicil, which prohibits interference based on familial discord. One of the board members, Mr. Hayes, shifted in his seat. "Sela's," he said carefully, "you know there were concerns about readiness, about influence." Grandpa didn't flinch. "Readiness isn't measured by pedigree," he said. "It's measured by character, and Clarissa's resume," he tapped the laminated sheet on the table, "is the most honest character reference I've ever seen." Then came the moment I hadn't expected. He turned to me. "Would you like to say anything?" I took a breath, stood, and for the first time I didn't shrink. "I'm not here to take what's yours," I said, looking at each of them in turn. "I'm here to honor what was always mine. My grandfather didn't give me this seat. He restored it, and I won't waste it on resentment. I'll spend it on purpose." Dr. Lin slid a notarized copy of the resolution toward each member. They signed without hesitation, Ms. Chen with a firm stroke, Mr. Hayes after a long sigh, the others with quiet resolve. But the true accountability came after. Grandpa opened a second envelope. This one contained a letter he'd written the night he found my resume in the diner. He didn't read it to them. He read it to me, aloud, in front of everyone. To Clarissa, "I saw your name on that paper, and my heart stopped. Not because you'd fallen, but because you'd risen without me. You didn't need my money to be worthy. But you deserved my presence. And I failed you. This isn't forgiveness I'm asking for. It's a chance to do better." Grandpa. Mrs. Delaney dabbed her eyes. Ms. Chen looked down, ashamed. Even Mr. Hayes cleared his throat roughly, avoiding my gaze. Because this wasn't just a legal correction. It was a moral reckoning. And in that room, under the weight of documented truth and witnessed confession, the silence that had followed my mother for decades finally broke, not with a shout, but with a single, steady voice saying, "I'm here, and I'm staying." 3 weeks later, I walked into the county trustee's office wearing a navy dress I'd bought myself, no borrowed blazer, no diner apron hidden underneath, and handed over a single file folder. Inside, the reactivated trust statement, the notarized resolution, my birth and death certificates, and the signed board appointment letter. The clerk, a woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, processed everything without a flicker of surprise, as if she'd seen 100 heirs reclaim what was theirs. But when she stamped the final page, claim VERIFIED, beneficiary status confirmed, she looked up and said, "Your grandfather came in here last week, asked if everything was in order. He seemed nervous." I smiled. He's been nervous for 14 years. That same afternoon, I met with the student financial office at the university. No more deferment requests, no more pleading for extensions. I presented the tuition payment authorization, direct from the trust, signed by both Grandpa and Dr. Lin, and watched as the bursar's eyes widened slightly at the clean official letterhead. "Your account is now fully settled," she said, printing a zero-balance confirmation. "And your fall semester enrollment is secured." She handed me the slip like it was a passport, and in a way it was. But the real moment, the one that made my breath catch, came when I stepped into the foundation's headquarters for my first official board orientation. The building wasn't flashy. It was all glass and steel and quiet efficiency, with a lobby that smelled of eucalyptus and fresh ink. At the reception desk, the clerk didn't ask who I was. She just smiled and said, "Ms. Thorne, your badge is ready." She handed me a laminated ID. Clarissa M. Thorne, board member, Thorne Foundation. Beneath it, my photo, no longer a girl in a coffee-stained apron, but someone who looked like she belonged. Grandpa was waiting in the conference room, standing by the window just as he had the night of the resolution. He didn't say anything when I entered. Just turned, took in my outfit, my posture, the way I carried the file folder like it weighed nothing now, and nodded. "You look like your mother," he said softly. When she walked into her first board meeting, same fire in her eyes. Later, as we left the building together, he didn't offer to drive me home. Instead, he walked me to the subway entrance, the same one I'd used for years, and stood with me until my train arrived. "You don't need me to hold your hand," he said, "but I'll stand here anyway." I hugged him then, not out of obligation, not out of guilt, but because for the first time I wanted to. His shoulders were thinner than I remembered, but his embrace was steady. That night back in my apartment, still modest, still mine, I opened my laptop, the new one, sleek and fast, paid for through the trust's structured allowance, and checked my online banking portal. There it was, the trust dashboard, my name at the top, the balance glowing in clean digits. But I didn't linger on the number. I scrolled to the withdrawal history tab and clicked on the latest entry. June 12, 2025, $1,500 rent payment, status, processed. No eviction notice, no panic, no landlord at the door, just a quiet transaction, verified, lawful, and mine. The sheriff never came. No dramatic standoff, no flashing lights. The reversal wasn't a spectacle, it was a signature, a stamp, a system finally working as it should. And as I closed the laptop and touched the silver locket at my throat, I realized something. I wasn't waiting for permission to exist anymore. I was already here. Documented, verified, and finally irrevocably seen. The consequences didn't arrive with sirens or headlines. They unfolded quietly, like ripples from a stone dropped long ago, finally reaching the shore. First came the landlord. 2 days after my rent cleared, he slipped a handwritten note under my door. Not an apology, not exactly, but close. "Heard you got things sorted. Glad it worked out." No signature, no phone number, just those 9 words on lined yellow paper, folded twice. I kept it, not as a trophy, but as proof that even the coldest transactions can thaw when dignity is restored. Then the relatives began to surface, not in person, but through the digital backchannels of our fractured family. A second cousin I hadn't spoken to since middle school sent a Facebook message. "Saw your name on the foundation site. Knew you were special. Let's grab coffee." An aunt who'd once told me at a funeral, "You're not really a thorn," now liked every photo I posted of my classes, my locket glinting in the sun. I didn't reply, didn't block them either. I just let their messages sit in the void they'd helped create for years. Silence, after all, is its own kind of boundary. But the most significant fallout came from within the company itself. At the next board meeting, Grandpa stood and announced, without fanfare, that Mr. Hayes, the same man who'd once questioned my readiness, would be stepping down from his advisory role. The reason wasn't stated aloud, but the subtext hung heavy in the air. He'd been the one who, years ago, advised against maintaining the trust after my mother's estrangement, calling it a liability with no return. He'd also been the one who'd quietly encouraged the narrative that I was unstable, that my absence meant disinterest. Grandpa didn't fire him out of spite. He simply said, "Our foundation's mission is intergenerational equity. If you can't see value in the next generation, you don't belong in the room where we build it." Hayes left without protest. His chair remained empty for a full month, a silent monument to the cost of underestimating someone because they wore an apron instead of a blazer. Even the bank took notice. The same institution that had once stamped my trust as dormant now sent a relationship manager to offer financial literacy workshops for foundation beneficiaries, workshops I helped design, ensuring they included modules on address verification, document retention, and how to navigate bureaucratic red tape when you're invisible. I didn't take pleasure in any of it. No smug satisfaction, no late-night reveling in their discomfort. What I felt was something quieter, more enduring, relief. Relief that the system, flawed, slow, often indifferent, had in the end worked because the evidence was too clear to ignore. The receipts had spoken. And when truth is documented, consequences aren't revenge. They're just balance. I still pass the old apartment building sometimes. The laundromat below still groans at night, but the third-floor window, the one with the towel stuffed in the gap, is now dark. Someone else lives there now, and when I walk by, I don't feel loss. I feel gratitude for the girl who survived it and for the man who finally saw her. Because in the end, I didn't need them to suffer. I just needed them to see. And now they do. It was a rainy Thursday in late September when he showed up at my door. Not in a suit, not with a briefcase, but in a faded windbreaker and worn sneakers, shoulders hunched against the downpour like a man who'd walked a long way with nowhere else to go. Marcus, my grandfather's former CFO, the one who'd quietly steered board sentiment against me for years, who'd once called my resume a cry for attention from someone who doesn't understand real work, stood on my landing with a grocery bag in one hand and rainwater dripping from his hair. "Can I come in?" he asked, voice rough, eyes avoiding mine. I didn't say yes, but I didn't close the door. He'd been gone from Thorne Industries for months, forced out after the audit revealed he'd advised Hayes to misclassify trust disbursements as administrative losses, a move that could have buried my claim for good. Now, he was renting a room above a laundromat not unlike the one I'd lived above, teaching night classes at a community college to make ends meet. The fall had been hard and fast. "I heard you started a scholarship," he said, finally meeting my gaze. "In your mother's name." I nodded. For single parents pursuing degrees in social services, anonymous funding. He shifted his weight. I applied to be a teaching assistant for the cohort. They turned me down." He let out a dry laugh. "Said my alignment with program values was questionable." Silence stretched between us, filled only by the drum of rain on the roof. I remembered the way he'd looked at me at that first dinner, like I was an inconvenience dressed as a person. Now he looked exhausted, human. "I'm not here to ask for a job," he said quickly. "Or money, I know I don't deserve that." He set the grocery bag down. It held instant noodles, a carton of eggs, a small bottle of ibuprofen. I need help finding housing that'll take someone with a spotty rental history, and maybe a reference for a job that isn't at a gas station." I studied him, the lines around his eyes deeper now, the arrogance gone, replaced by something raw and unguarded. This wasn't the man who tried to erase me. This was the man who'd been hollowed out by his own choices. Grandpa had told me, weeks ago, grace isn't about forgetting what they did. It's about refusing to let it define what you become. So I didn't offer him a check, didn't invite him in for tea, but I pulled out my phone and opened the Notes app. "I'll connect you with Maria Lopez," I said. "She runs the Tenant Resilience Project downtown. They help people rebuild credit and find landlords who look beyond past evictions." I typed her number into his phone myself. "And I'll call the nonprofit where I work. They're hiring a logistics coordinator for their food distribution program. It's not glamorous, but it's honest work. I'll tell them you're capable if you agree to 3 conditions." He looked up wary. "What conditions?" "First," I said, holding his gaze, "you sign a written agreement that you won't contact me directly again. No calls, no texts, no showing up unannounced. All communication goes through HR or Maria." "Second," I continued, "you complete the financial accountability course the foundation now requires for all former staff involved in trust mismanagement. It's 8 weeks, online, free. And third," I said softly, "you pay back the $1,200 you withdrew from the community outreach slush fund during your last month at Thorne. Not to me, to the foundation, in monthly installments, with interest." He blinked, nodded slowly. "I can do that." "Good," I said. "Then I'll vouch for your work ethic, not your character. Those are 2 different things." I stepped back toward the door but paused. Marcus, this isn't forgiveness, it's structure. And it's the same chance my grandfather gave me when I was broken, and too proud to ask. He swallowed hard. Thank you, he whispered. I closed the door gently, not with finality, but with clarity. Later that night, I lit a candle in my kitchen, the same one Grandpa had given me on my first day as a board member, and thought about how grace doesn't mean opening the gate. Sometimes, it just means handing someone a map to build their own. And walking away while they learn to read it. Spring came softly that year, daffodils pushing through cracked sidewalk seams, cherry blossoms dusting the air like pink snow, the kind of renewal that doesn't announce itself but simply arrives, one quiet morning at a time. And with it, the house on Sycamore Lane. Well, it wasn't mine, not legally, not yet. But Grandpa had quietly transferred the deed of the old Thorn Rose Garden property into a conservation trust with a single clause. To be maintained as a community learning space, stewarded by Clarissa M. Thorne in perpetuity. I didn't move in. Not in the way I'd once dreamed as a child. No grand bedroom, no marble floors. Instead, I turned the sunroom, the one where Grandpa used to read newspapers with his pipe, into a gathering place. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, I host writing workshops for formerly incarcerated women, single parents, and elders documenting their oral histories. The tables are second-hand, the chairs mismatched, the coffee brewed in a percolator that whistles like a tea kettle. But the stories that fill that room, they're gold. I still stop by the greasy spoon every Sunday, not to work, but to leave something behind. On clean napkins tucked under sugar shakers, I write prompts. What did you survive that no one knows about? What's the first thing you'd tell your younger self? Sometimes customers write back. I find their answers folded under ketchup bottles, tucked into the tip jar, even taped to the bathroom mirror. A bus driver once wrote, I kept my kids fed by selling plasma. They think it was overtime. A teenager scribbled, I got into college but can't afford to go. Still proud though. I collect them all. File them in a wooden box on the sunroom shelf, next to the silver locket and a framed photo of Mom and me at the county fair, the one where she won that blue ribbon for pie. Grandpa visits every few weeks. He doesn't sit in on the workshops. He waters the roses, still blooming, decades later, and reads in the garden gazebo with Mrs. Delaney, who now volunteers as a memoir editor for the participants. Last month, he gave me a small velvet pouch. Inside was a second locket, identical to mine, but engraved on the back with a single word. Always. I had it made the week after I found your resume, he confessed, voice low. I carried it in my pocket for months, afraid you'd say no if I offered it. I fastened it around his neck right there, under the wisteria vines, my fingers brushing the papery skin of his throat. He didn't cry, but his hand covered mine for a long moment, and the sun through the leaves made his silver hair glow like a halo. People ask if I've moved on from the diner, from the evictions, from the years of being unseen. But I haven't moved on. I've carried it all with me into this new life, not as baggage, but as compass. Because the truth is, dignity wasn't waiting for me in a boardroom. It was in the chipped mug at the greasy spoon. In the library computer that froze during interviews. In the locket I never took off, even when I felt unworthy of its weight. Now, when I walk into the foundation headquarters, I don't feel like an imposter. I feel like a bridge. And every time I pass a delivery truck with the thorn compass rose on its side, I don't look away. I wave. Because I'm not just riding in the vehicle now. I'm helping to steer it. It's strange, the things that stay with you. Not the private jets or the boardroom appointments or even the moment a billion-dollar trust finally bears your name. No, it's the quiet reckonings. The way your hands stop shaking when you sign a lease that's truly yours. The first time you say, I'm Clarissa Thorne, without bracing for disbelief. The weight of a silver locket that no longer feels like a secret, but a signature. If you've ever been told your pain was just family drama while someone quietly erased your place at the table, if you've rewritten your resume on napkins, hidden your last name like a wound, or chosen pride over help because you feared it would cost you your dignity, I need you to hear this. Your worth was never conditional on their acknowledgement. You were always enough. You were always here. And your receipts, those bank statements, those notarized letters, those timestamps of survival, are not just proof for them. They're proof for you, proof that you showed up, even when no one was watching. So if this story found you at the right time, don't just let it pass through you. Share it with the cousin who's fighting for her grandmother's will, the friend rebuilding after a toxic inheritance battle, the sibling who's been gaslit out of their birthright. Drop a link in a group chat. Print a page and leave it on a bench. Stories like ours only heal when they echo. And if you're standing where I once stood, drowning in silent debt, erased from family records, wondering if you'll ever be seen, know this: help exists. The National Association of Estate Planners offers free consultations for contested trusts. Many counties have public trustee offices that can help verify dormant accounts. And nonprofits like the Family Justice Project specialize in quiet, lawful restoration for those excluded from legacies through no fault of their own. You don't need a billionaire grandfather. You just need one verified document, one ally who believes you, and the courage to ask, "What's mine?" As for me, I'm already working on the next chapter. Not mine, but someone else. Last month, a young woman applied for the Alina Thorne Scholarship. Her essay was raw, brilliant, full of fire. And when I looked at her application photo, dark eyes, crooked smile, a silver chain glinting at her throat, I had to call Grandpa, because her last name was Thorne too. A distant branch, lost to the same silences that nearly swallowed me. Turns out, legacies don't just end. Sometimes, they circle back, quiet, patient, waiting for someone to pick up the thread. So stay kind, stay documented, and never forget, the most powerful inheritance isn't money. It's the courage to claim your name, and the grace to help others reclaim theirs.